Well, hello, good afternoon, and welcome to all of you to this masterpiece in conversation about the life and work of the photographer, filmmaker, painter, graphic artist, William Klein. My name is Edward Dimsdale. I'm a photographic artist, a writer on photography and culture, and professor of creative practice at the Cambridge School of Visual and Performing Arts. And it's my very happy role this afternoon to introduce two experts in their respective fields and to help moderate a conversation which aims to provide some insights into the scope of William Klein's career, primarily focusing on his pioneering approaches to photography and image making, whilst also touching on some other significant aspects. To my far left is David Hopkins, Emeritus Professor of Art History and Professorial Research Fellow at the University of Glasgow. David has lectured internationally and published numerous books on subjects such as Dada, Surrealism, Marcel Duchamp, Max Ernst, and 1980s art. His study of post-1945 art and photography, After Modern Art, 1945 to 2017, is now in its second edition, and is actually one of the set texts that I can well remember assigning to fine art students in the past. His most recent publication is Dark Toys, Surrealism and the Culture of Childhood, published by Yale University Press in 2021. And photography has often been at the very center of his research. And he's also curated an exhibition on Ouija and written on topics ranging from Man Ray to Douglas Gordon. And he's currently working on a study of 20th century photography. And to my immediate left is Marcus Berry, who co-founded HackelBury Fine Art here in London in 1997. Marcus works closely with artists on their exhibitions, publications, and museum projects, and with clients on shaping their collections. Marcus has been working closely with William Klein for over 20 years, promoting his work and raising his profile. It was Marcus who introduced William's work to international curators and institutions, including David Campany, who's the lead curator for the major retrospective William Klein, Yes, Photographs, Paintings, Films, 1948-2013, currently on at the ICP, the International Center for Photography in New York, which opened in June of this year and continues through until September. HackelBury was integral in restoring and supplying works to the William Klein Daido Moriyama exhibition at Tate Modern in 2012-13, and the gallery also arranged a William Klein Film Festival with the Lycée Français in London, as well as the In Conversation between William and David Campany for Photo London at the National Portrait Gallery in London in 2017. HackelBury have exhibited William's work many times and published the William Klein books, Paintings, etc., and Black and Light. Gentlemen, welcome. By way of a general introduction, I suppose, William is perhaps best known for his fashion photography and his distinctive gritty style of street photography. Next slide, please. Together with his decidedly unconventional approach to subject matter. We are wanting to consider as many aspects of his career as we can in the time available, including his early training as a painter, as well as his work as a filmmaker, all set against the wider context of art, historical and cultural developments throughout his long career. We also hope to explore the relationship between artist and gallery. Some of these opening images that you're just seeing on the screen at the moment primarily come from two sources. William's Painted Contacts series. There's the book here for anyone wanting to have a look at it at the conclusion of this talk. And also, we'll return to these towards the end of the talk as well to kind of discuss them further, as well as documentation images from the 2012-2013 Tate Modern retrospective. But before we get into the conversation itself, I thought we might begin with some of William's own words. I came from the outside. The rules of photography didn't interest me. There were things you could do with a camera that you couldn't do with any other medium. Grain, contrast, blur, cockeyed framing, eliminating or exaggerating gray tones, and so on. I thought it would be good to show what's possible. To say that this is as valid a way of using the camera as conventional approaches. So perhaps this notion of coming from the outside and refusing to take the conventional route in almost any and every circumstance These are two key attributes that would appear to be characteristic of both his work as well as of the man himself. And I suppose, Marcus, just coming to you first, for those perhaps familiar with the work, but less familiar with the man himself, could you perhaps shed some light on some of the more unconventional aspects of William's personality? I mean, what's he like to work with?
William doesn't like to be tied down, and so he works with a lot of different galleries, and he assigns different galleries different tasks. So the task he set me was, if you want an exhibition, get me a film, get me a film festival and a museum show. So, it took 10 years. And we got the Elysee and the Tate Modern, and then he was happy to do, have a full exhibition of his work. He's often included in group exhibitions, but he's very particular about his single person exhibitions.
I think, I'm wary of asking the question, and now could you tell us some of the story? Well, maybe we'll come back to some of the anecdotes later on. We could be spending the entirety of this just kind of hearing about some of these stories. We will get back to those. But thank you. I think it gives some indication that kind of the personality of the artist can be seen absolutely kind of in the works as well, and kind of useful to hear that. Born in Upper Manhattan in 1928 and still kind of with us, still kind of lively, schooled in New York, Klein joined the US Army and spent 2 years in occupied Europe, arriving there in 1948. And as part of the GI Bill at the time, the Army then provided cultural opportunities for US Army serving in Europe. And perhaps, David, you could pick up the story now, as this is very much an example of what William was referring to in describing himself as coming from the outside.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's very interesting to think of William Klein as a painter, because, we normally think of him as a photographer. So, it's one of the interesting things we have to think about today, and to think about how aspects of his painting might eventually feed into his photography. And that's something we can come on to. But what we're looking at here is a painting, I think it was about 1948 or 49, of kind of, as you said, it's kind of still life, if you like, with a potato masher. So a slightly peculiar subject for a still life painting. But I guess showing his interest in, kind of gadgets and technology, if you want to, in a broader sense. Interesting here, the kind of very, very pronounced kind of pattern, the flattening out of the forms in the painting. These things suggest that he was very well aware of the avant-garde. And I think this is one of the main points to make at the very beginning here, which is that we know that even after he was, as a kind of teenager, he visited the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So he had this fantastic collection of modernism to look at. And he clearly absorbed it really very quickly in a way. When he got to Paris, when he got to the States, he manifests, I think, the influence of people like Leger and Fernand Léger, possibly like Miro. I mean, here you can see Miro sort of flattening out the shapes, particularly of the all the objects here to some extent are kind of flattened out on the picture surface. Something of that is there in William's work. Here you can see the kind of patterning, surface patterning that I mentioned earlier in relation to his painting. And I think also this is a Léger painting, and Léger's interest in kind of mechanized bodies and things like that, I think is something which William Klein also took up in his paintings at this time.
I mean, not illustrated here, but Léger also, as a filmmaker, creating Ballet Mécanique in 1924, right. Collaboration with Man Ray, concatenations of noises and sounds, and actually sirens. We just had one going past outside at the same time. Very much the atmosphere of post-Dada that he was experiencing when working with Léger, studying with Léger in Paris.
Yes, it studied in Paris and also André Lotte as well, but he preferred Léger. He was very impressed with Léger. He saw Léger as a kind of big, brutish kind of, kind of man of the people, if you like. And Léger had done these enormous pictures. This is a very large painting, I think, but he had also done mural-sized things, which I think Klein was very, very impressed with. He liked the kind of socialist aspect of Léger, I think. And also Léger's collaborations with architects, such as Le Corbusier. So this is kind of interesting, almost a cross-disciplinary thing going on in Klein, I think, at this time. He's not interested just in painting, but also in kind of environmental, things of large scale, kind of environmental pieces.
Moving from the canvas to the streets,
effectively,
into the real world.
Yeah.
And so William worked in Léger's studio, and he had to buy the canvases and the paints. And he prepped the paintings for Léger, and Léger would finish them. But Léger was also important in saying, get out of the studio, and he broke a lot of boundaries for William. Anything could go, was what Léger was instilled in William.
So William was kind of imbibing these atmospheres, wasn't he? These kind of strategies, these modern strategies, and so David, maybe talk a little bit about what we're looking at here.
Well, we've looked at sort of avant-garde painting. Actually, the last one, just briefly, we might flip back to it. It's more kind of abstracted, perhaps, than the previous one we looked at. And I think here we know that he knew Ellsworth Kelly, actually, who was a kind of hard-edge abstractionist. From New York painter, and I think there's something of maybe Kelly or somebody there. It's a bit more uncompromising. You can't really read it very easily. It's got those very jagged kind of forms that we somehow identify, I think, with Klein, and the black and white contrasts, very, very strong things throughout his career. But anyway, if we go on, sorry. Yeah, so here we're looking at avant-garde photography, and he very clearly absorbed what was going on in terms of experimental photography in the 1920s and early 1930s. Man Ray, who's one of his photograms there on the right, is associated, of course, with Dada and with Surrealism. And Molinage on the left is associated really with the Bauhaus, with what is sometimes called New Vision photography. But what these have in common is that they're both essentially photograms. Photograms actually go back to the very beginnings of photography, but in a sense it was revived in the early 20th century by these two artists in particular. And basically what it involves is simply placing objects on light-sensitive paper and then turning on the enlarger and producing an image without a camera, basically. It's kind of camera-less photography. But it's experimental. It's it's very difficult to read these things. What are the objects? And there's kind of very dynamic contrast of light and dark, and the kind of blurry effects that you get there. These are things which I think William Klein would have picked up on.
You see him picking up on it in this way. This being his particular take on the photogram. Essentially, not strictly speaking a photogram, but the manipulation of light onto photographic paper, onto a sensitive surface by means of various apertures, circles, squares, and moving then
That's right.
These apertures across. It's in some senses, it's a really essential form of photography. I mean, photography is nothing other than light modified by objects, and this is precisely what we're looking at.
Yes, I think there was a sequence of these photographs which derived from a kind of a furniture fixture, if you like, that he had to produce, a kind of room divider with kind of slatted elements to it, which could be kind of turned around manually, and then he kind of photographed it using slow exposure and so on. So I think some of them are to do with that. These ones are the slatted ones, I think. You might know better about that.
Yeah,
where he used the card.
These were from when was it? 52, and this is how William got into Vogue. with an exhibition and he was spotted by
Alexander Lieberman.
Alexander Lieberman.
Yeah, I think it's kind of instructive. I mean, here he is really soaking up abstraction, the spirit of abstraction, the strategy of abstraction, the expressions of the universal rather than the individual. But taking it into his own space and moving it into architectural space. I mean, he ended up producing a number of different kind of covers for Domus. Through these works in these ways. I'd be really interested, Marcus, just to talk a little bit more about how actually some of this abstract work came to light. Here we're looking at one of the installation shots from the Tate Modern exhibition from 2012-2013. But it reflects back on the relationship between gallerist and artist. Could you just speak a little bit about that? Sorry, please.
We got permission to go to William's studio to catalog a few things, right? And so William is quite private, and so it was a unique situation. So we took along 2 photographers and lots of lights, and we went into the studio and we documented everything. And William Klein's assistant was there, and there was a cupboard, and we said, well, what's in the cupboard? And the assistant said, I'm not allowed to look. You know, the assistant had been there for nearly 30 years, right? And they'd never opened the cupboard in the studio. And so, being very French, you know, at 12:30, the studio assistant said, well, I've got to go for lunch, you know, and that's 2 hours or so. So as soon as he left, I was like, I just got to look in that cupboard, you know. So we opened the cupboard and we photographed everything in the cupboard. And, you know, we did it, we had to move quite quickly. So we were just documenting. We weren't stealing anything. We were just documenting everything. And then William Klein's assistant came back and his son came in, and they were both horrified we'd opened the cupboard. And so they called the lawyers and we were evicted. But basically we'd been there a day or two, so we had catalogued everything. And then in showing William, we went along to William and said, you know, here's everything in your studio catalogued, you know, massive pile of things. And, you know, my assistant said, look what we found. And William said, I never fucking lost them. They were in that cupboard. And so, you know, William wasn't keen on releasing a whole lot of images. And there were some, the fashion and light, this particular image, the backstory to it is that these are the last fashion images William took with Vogue before he was fired, because he made a film sending up Vogue and all the people in the fashion industry. So he wasn't keen on having these images out in there because there was a backstory and he was unhappy with it. I got permission to get one of them printed, and I got it specially framed and went back to Paris and showed him the framed, polished up image, and he agreed to releasing 4 of them. And then after 4, we sold those, and then he released basically all of the images from that fashion shoot. And what is interesting about this work is that it's fashion. It's from the 60s, it's from 67, but it also harps back to his abstract work from the 50s. And so it's combining, it's not just something out of nowhere. It's William is still working the abstract field.
Yeah, and very much an example of photographers, the likes of which Alexander Lieberman were commissioning for Vogue, or Alexei Brodovich for Harper's Bazaar. They were looking for the artists who would bring in kind of the avant-garde ideas to help kind of galvanize what essentially were kind of the ways that the new ideas were coming into contemporary culture at the time. And this might be an example of that. I mean, talking about the avant-garde, maybe we could just come back to this, David, just the avant-garde influence on Klein's work, maybe particularly in relation to his kind of photography. I don't know if you want to speak.
Yeah, so we're going on to the photography a little bit in a minute. So I think, as well as things like photograms, one was seeing kind of new types of photography produced by people like Rodchenko and Moholy-Nagy again. This is a straight photograph, but obviously it's taken from a kind of worm's eye view. So we're looking, up at under the chin, if you like, of this pioneer bugler in Moscow. Again, so it kind of abstracts the image, it defamiliarizes. That was the word that was used very much by these people, the new vision photographers and the Soviet photographers, defamiliarization. It throws you out of your normal frame of reference, into some kind of world which you have to make sense of in some way, And so I think this is precisely the kind of thing that William was broadly interested in. Okay, I'm not saying that that's doing.
He's kept doing that. He's kept that shock effect.
Yes, we'll talk about Dada in a minute as well, I guess. But this is another. I just wanted to just mention this project. And if we go on to the next slide, actually, it'd be better. This was from a series of photographs of Dutch barns, which were photographed by Klein, by William in about, I think, 1952, and were shown in Vogue. It was it was a Vogue spread. They were published by Alexander Lieberman. And what he's done here is he's given you both the positive and the negative print, as it were, to play around in a sense with the tonal contrast. And also to produce this quite severe sort of modernist image, really. If you go back to the previous slide, then there are obvious connections to Mondrian, who was one of the great sort of very severe, if you like, geometric abstractionists of the early 20th century. And of course, as I said, those photographs were actually were taken actually fairly near where Mondrian had lived at one point. So in a sense, these are a kind of homage, if you like, to Mondrian.
So on the one hand, the more universal abstraction figured here, and then also, but Klein, is also very much about, getting into the face of people in the streets. We're coming on to more the street photography here. I mean, do you want to talk a little bit just about the kind of the context into which Klein was starting to work?
Well, we've said that he went to New York around 1940. He was invited by Alexander Lieberman to take photographs. He kind of persuaded Lieberman, I think, to carry out this project, and Lieberman financed it largely. This was back in New York now, and Klein went back there and, as it were, rediscovered where he'd come from. This is around 1950. He took these photographs in late 1954, 55. They are kind of street photographs. We go back to the one just for a second. This is one of the most famous, iconic images in the book that came out of that 1954-55 project, which is called Life is Good for You and Good for You in New York, which actually came from some kind of advertising slogan, all right? It's been republished, this book, and it's often just called New York, 1954-55, but the full title was Life is Good for You and Good for You in New York. And it's a very, very powerful image. He's kind of thrusting the camera into the faces of these people. He saw New York as a very tough, hard, kind of anxious, difficult place, and he wanted to get that into the photographs. I've got a short quote about this one. Let me find. I've got one or two choice little quotes, and I wanted to read them out because I think sometimes his words are best. He says, pseudo poster for the American dream, Italian cop, integrated Hispanic and Yiddish mama, African American lady with beret, the melting pot. New York was a cultural melting pot. And, it's the framing here is fascinating. Basically it's kind of the surface of the photograph is almost divided into four. It's very, very dynamic, very unusual to kind of use that sort of format. And so we're seeing here a new kind of photography, which, as I said, was financed effectively by Alexander Liberman to begin with, and allowed Klein the freedom really to experiment, which was what he wanted to do at this point with photography.
Yeah, we see him, I suppose, coming into into a context, a photographic context, where there were a number of significant photographers working, kind of Walker Evans, Ouija. Maybe we shouldn't spend too long kind of looking at these or considering these.
No, but it puts them in a context.
Per se, but putting it into the context. Next slide, please. Yeah. It's just as one kind of point, I suppose. Actually, Klein writes well about his own photographs.
Very well.
The text that he produces, sometimes very short, very pithy, in the New York book, kind of say everything that might need to be said.
So let's say something about Ouija. This is a photograph, a very famous photograph of the first murder, in which Ouija more or less, basically, Ouija was a very opportunistic photographer who produced photographs for the New York tabloids, gory, kind of, frightening, some disturbing images, very often of, he's on the scene of murders and things like that. And this is a group of people reacting to a murder which has just taken place, okay? It's a remarkable picture because they're all, they don't all seem to be reacting to what's in front of them, but, they're all moving and looking in different directions and so on. But I just want to make the point that Ouija produced a book in 1945 called Naked City, which in some ways is a forerunner, I think, for New York. I think very important influence really on the way William Klein approached the city.
Yeah. Next slide, please.
So we're seeing a few more. This image I want to talk about again in using Klein. I just bought a 28mm wide-angle lens, and looking in the viewfinder, realized immediately it would become my normal lens. Preset, ever ready. I could even shoot without aiming. I waded through packed sidewalks, firing from the hip, actually the chest, only deciphering the next day what I'd done, framed by look, instinct, whatever. I liked what the one-eyed camera could do almost on its own, oblivious of Beaux-Arts composition, tired laws of perspective, the golden mean, all of that.
Just, I suppose, another context, I suppose, just before we kind of move on to, again, other kind of aspects of this would be, next slide, please, is the work of Robert Frank as well, another context, a comparative context for...
Yeah, that's interesting in terms of history of photography, because when you think about street photography, which is what we associate Klein with, he was in a tradition, we talked about Ouija already, but he had one great contemporary who was Robert Frank. And Robert Frank produced a book called The Americans in 1958. It was actually 2 years after William Klein's New York book had been published. But showing very, very similar interests. Both photographers are interested in kind of, tilting the frame of the camera, ignoring traditional rules about composition, using blur. Here we see Frank use it, but we just, in the previous picture, saw Klein using this kind of blur through using sort of a slow exposure time, or maybe even kind of slightly jiggling the camera.
And other blurring techniques as well. I think the next slide, please, kind of indicates that.
Yeah, it's a famous one.
Yeah, in terms of kind of darkroom manipulations to be able to kind of create this sense of kind of dynamism, fluidity that was very much kind of a hallmark.
The picture's called Candy Store, and basically he kind of jiggled the enlarger, right, of the, when he was printing the picture to produce the bleeding of the black into the white, kind of checkerboard in the background. Yeah.
I suppose just one more inheritance of the legacies of modernism. Next slide, please. The photo montage, the work of Raoul Haussmann, but kind of one sees that also very much kind of pressing an influence on
It's
Klein's work?
Dada. I mean, I think one can't sort of overstate the importance, the general importance of things like Dada and maybe Surrealism for Klein. I don't think there's very often any very obvious kind of visual links, perhaps the typographic ones. I'll talk about this in a second, but it's more the attitude of Dada, you know, the kind of love of the absurd, the love of contradictions, you know, in modern life, the urgency of kind of modern experience and the kind of conflicting kind of images that come at you, you know, in the modern city. These are kind of legacies of Dada in a way. And there you saw in the last thing a Haussmann photo montage, and you can see here a William Klein photograph from the New York book in which he's fascinated by signage, by signs, by neon signs, things like that, by lettering, you know, almost in a kind of abstract way.
Yeah, it's Klein, the graphic artist, but also Klein, the filmmaker.
Yeah.
These are stills from Broadway by Lights. Marcus, did you want to just speak about that particular film? It's one of his first films.
Well, William made this film at the same time. It was in color. It was, he set it to jazz music. It was one of the first color films. It was early on in color filmmaking, and he was offered, on the back of that was offered jobs in LA, which he turned down. There were so many openings for William. He could have gone in a lot of different directions, and he stuck with Vogue at the time. Yeah. And so this was William's first film, and William carried on to make a whole lot of films after that.
I mean, we don't really have the time to be able to cover all of that aspect of his work. But you know, here are two posters of two of those films. Experimental feature Qui êtes-vous, Polly Magoo, which was a satire.
Which got him fired from Vogue.
Which got him fired from Vogue. We'll come back to that a little bit later, but in one particular context, I think. But also the film that he made about Muhammad Ali over a period of years. But you know, and these films led on to other films. I mean, he produced some, I mean, made, I don't know how many kind of features and documentaries. I mean, it's in the dozens.
Yeah, well, William was a boxer in the army, and he's very fond of sport. So he made films on Bjorn Borg. He's friends with the Venus sisters, Venus Williams and Serena, and a lot of, you know, he is always asking what's happening with sport is one of his, he's a big sports buff.
It's the dynamism, it's competition, it's life, it's all of that.
But it's fascinating. He was a boxer at one point because, you know, his photographs particularly are like that, you know.
They're in your face.
You know, they're kind of really in your face, exactly.
Really close.
Yeah.
I think, well, just in terms of, there we go. But in terms of, we'll just kind of move on a couple of slides to the New York book. We've spoken about it before, but it's particularly in relation to his work as a graphic artist as much as anything else. Again, working with typography, experimental. He produced all the visuals for this. It wasn't a designer producing it. It was
and he didn't. Himself. It was a problem to get it published.
He couldn't get it published in the United States. It was published in France. Édition du Seuil. Chris Marker, filmmaker, was the editor there.
Yes, absolutely.
And what did they say about the book when it was released? It was full bleed, and they said it was disgusting because there were no page numbers. There was no text. It was just straight in your face. Yeah. And they said, you know, he doesn't respect the viewer because it wasn't nicely mounted or anything. The printing was very graphic. It was hard on, it was very black and white. It was reduced to the paper was almost like newspaper. And so it was, people were, you know, the first people to review the book were saying, you know, this is an insult to the viewer, but it's now one of the most sought after books in photography.
If you just go back to the previous a slide just briefly. Not that one, the one before. So that's the original, that's the first edition, I think the Edition du Seuil one. And that one is the later one that was actually, it was republished in, I think, 1995 by Dewey Lewis. In both instances, of course, he's been involved with the cover design. But I think it's worth saying that his interest in signage, which we saw, in relation to the film as well, is often seen as a kind of forerunner of pop art, really. In the early 1960s, the sort of avant-garde, in a sense, in America, turns its attention to popular signage, commodity culture, and things like that. And you can see him actually, a precursor in many ways of that attitude.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One critic at the time described this kind of photograph as scrofulous. People didn't know what to make of it. There hadn't been many kind of approaches that were so anti-technique, that were so prepared to kind of disdain it in that way.
This is full of signage, proto-pop.
As a personal note, this book, when I started an apprenticeship as a photographic printer with Max and Nitin Vidukal, the fashion photographers, way back when, this was the book in the darkroom that was like, now print like this and it'll be okay. It took a little while, but these sorts of qualities that were there in the book, which were really quite shocking at the time, but then have become a benchmark of a certain way of engaging with the world. I mean, there's all sorts of incredibly iconic images. Roland Barthes in
Yes.
Camera Lucida
Yes.
talks about this to try and illustrate his point of the punctum, and then Klein responds and says, and counters, but I mean, let's not get into the photo theory
But it's
here.
the teeth. It's the teeth.
But it's the teeth,
Barthes.
the carious teeth.
It's not the gun. It's going to be the teeth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, I mean, it's the way in which I suppose Klein kind of leaches into kind of photo history and photo theory. He was there producing these images that subsequently academics have pored over and argued about.
So this is one of his own favourites. This photograph. I wanted to read. I'm sorry. I've got another quote from him which I like. And I like to read out. These were my first real photographs. I had neither training nor complexes. By necessity and choice, I decided that anything would have to go. A technique of no taboos, as our title. Blur, grain, contrast, cockeyed framing, accidents, whatever happens. As for content, pseudo-ethnography, parody, dada.
There hadn't been many precedents. I mean, there'd been some experimentation in 1911-12 by the Italian futurists. There'd been Alexei Brodovich's book Ballet, published in 1945, where he wasn't a photographer. Therefore, there were these technical faults. But it really was it was new. I mean, we might look at an image now and be able to find all sorts of legacies of it. But at the time, it was.
He says about this: end of the day, dance. Somewhere in Brooklyn, the light was going. I used a slow shutter speed, 1/15 or 1/8 of a second. So that's how you get the blur, right? I doubt whether I knew what I'd be getting. It was only the day after that I discovered what the blur would contribute. Accident, error, luck. So the blur. And it's also there at the left of that photograph. It becomes the kind of signature aspect of his photographs. Of course, it's completely contrary to to what classic photography was supposed to be about. What photography was supposed to be about. This one's also interesting because the guy on the right, I think, is trying to sort of avoid the photographer, trying to get out of the way, sort of thing. But Klein has still sort of kept him in the image, the picture. So it's interesting. I haven't really got a lot to say except that the composition is fascinating. It's also very haunting photograph. I think this one. One of these, double page bleed, double page spread things.
Really heavily inked photogravure production. Yeah. And again, this notion of the tabloid, of the media context coming right into the book as well. Right. So from the gunman on the front pages of the newspapers to, next slide, please.
Oh, well. This is the classic one, which I think he hates now, in a way, because it's been reproduced everywhere, including my last book, I'm afraid. But it's an iconic photograph of a boy full of malice, appearing to point a gun at the camera. And in a sense, he's simply reflecting what Klein's doing to him, you might say. Klein was pointing his camera right at the boy. But, it's very famous because although the boy seems to be full of malice, we'll show you something later on to prove that, in fact, it was just the whole thing was a setup, a joke. Klein had basically asked the boy to do this. We're not really looking at a kind of horrible incident in New York at all.
No.
There's another boy with a gun. Obviously, very, very potent images these days when, kind of gun incidents and so on, and the whole issue of guns is so important for modern day America.
Yeah, absolutely. He proceeded to produce a series of books around other cities, Rome, Moscow, Tokyo, between 1958 and 1962. There are just a few images here from one of those books, from the Moscow book. Here, this again, a very kind of famous image. It says something about the personality of the photographer. He's not trying to hide. He's not trying to kind of stealthily take pictures on the slide. He's there directly engaging with the subjects. Marcus, in terms of kind of when he went back to Moscow for an exhibition in 2007, I think there's a story.
Well, William went back to Moscow and he decided he wanted to go back to the subway stations to photograph, just to passage of time and things. So William had a translator and a security guard, and they went down onto the subway station, and after an hour or so they got arrested and they got taken, and the translator said, look, to the police, do you know who this is? This is he's got an exhibition in Moscow. The queues are 2 hours long to get into the exhibition. This is William Klein. And the policeman said, I wear his underwear. And I was like, no, you don't.
So this is an image from the Rome book, and I suppose it's just a segue through to coming back to Klein as a fashion photographer, as someone who, I think often fashion photography can be kind of denigrated as if somehow it's not kind of art photography, and yet to be a fashion photographer and to be able to operate at that level, at that degree of the pace at which one needs to continually be kind of coming up with kind of new ideas and regularly shooting. This is an image here also in Rome, Spanish Steps it's called, and I suppose an example of how William could work in the studio, but he could equally would want to take models out into the world, and it was again that sense of dynamism, of energy, and of actuality.
Well, Frank Horvath is William had never really taken any photographs, and Frank Horvath is the first sort of photographer who did fashion on the street. And so William knew Frank, and William went to Frank and said, well, what advice can you give me? And Frank said, well, get a telephoto lens and then be a long way away, and then you can capture a mood and things. So this is as a result of the interaction with Frank Horvath.
Just another example of actually using that telephoto lens and creating staged encounters that you can't quite work out what actually happened, what's staged. But yeah, but not just only working with a wide angle lens, but also working kind of with other ways as well. This image here, which might not appear to be transgressive to our eyes today, perhaps, Marcus, worth talking about. Actually at the time, these images of the models smoking without gloves.
Yeah, this was the cover of Vogue, and it was in the 50s. It was at a time women wore gloves and they smoked with cigarette holders. And so this is without gloves, without cigarette holders. It was considered almost like having a prostitute on the cover of Vogue. It was very confrontational. It sort of had crossed a barrier in a way at the time.
And he was always prepared. He was looking for the barrier in order to transgress it. I would almost say that the most transgressive thing about this image today is not so much the fact of the smoking, the cigarette, and the lack of gloves and the lack of cigarette holder, but it's the fact that the model's forehead hasn't been retouched. You know, that again is that little injection of the real into the space of the image, which I think still holds today. But one sees throughout his fashion photography, there's always this sense of inventiveness, of looking to kind of create confusing images. These images here, kind of working with mirrors out there on location, kind of splintering images, creating. I mean, he was being, reflecting the op art of the period. These final two images here, or these two images here, from the Kiet Vu Polymagu, the film about the kind of the satire, I suppose, of the fashion industry, with caricatures of Diana Vreeland mentioned before. But what I think is really interesting, if you haven't seen the film Kiet Vu Polymagu, it's worth watching, because for all of the kind of satirical, kind of tongue-in-cheek, ironic approach, actually, as the filmmaker, he looks out for Polly, who is kind of the model, the protagonist of the film, and she's a fragile character, but he's clearly rooting for her. He's clearly, there's care in a sense in that film for that character, even if the rest is there to be lampooned.
It's also worth saying that, I mean, just in wider cultural context, I think, that film, he picks up on the new wave directors, Chris Marker, we talked about earlier, being something of an influence, but also Jean-Luc Godard, Fellini, there's he's not really new wave, but French new wave director, but also Fellini. A whole range of different sources come in as well. So he's very significant in the history of filmmaking, just as he is in the history of photography. And it's important that we see this multi-dimensional William Klein. I think that's coming across quite strongly today.
He's a performer as well, of course, in La Jetée, in Chris Marker's La Jetée. Right. He appears as, he and his wife Jeanne appear as emissaries from the future. And it's, again, well worth watching. I suppose just trying to draw some of these threads together. David, you spoke about just the everything that William is. He can't be kept in one particular box or one particular kind of genre. And I suppose there's something about this series here, the Painted Contact series, that is a synthesis of the photographer, the artist, the filmmaker. The very idea that a contact sheet for a photographer, certainly in relation to analog photography, is you can see how a photographer is thinking, and William has written and spoken about that. You can tell that moment where the photograph happens. The image before is not a photograph. The image afterwards is not a photograph until the Chinograph pencil and then latterly the enamel paint identifies that moment where it all comes together. So this series is really rather totemic, isn't it?
It is. And just to briefly go back to an earlier point, obviously the photograph at the top is this iconic photograph, Gun 1, I think it's called. And you can see underneath on the left, I think the frame that came immediately after that, when you see the boy smiling, the whole thing was a joke, effectively, it was a setup. But of course, we never saw that before you produce these painted contacts.
Marcus, could you just say a little bit more about the genesis of the painted contacts, or kind of how you've particularly been kind of working with William with this series?
Well, we haven't really worked with William. I mean, with William, these are William's ideas. He refused to have anyone paint the painted contacts. I tried to get him an assistant to help paint, because William's quite old and he can't move much. This is William's favorite body of work. It includes everything about William: the films, the graphics, the fashion, the straight photography, and William's. This embodies everything about William.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because for me it goes back to Leger and things like that. The color, these red, the primary colors, reds, yellows, blues. In the early Leger paintings, you get those kind of color overlays and things.
The energy, the dynamism,
the energy as well.
The
you can see him going back here to his kind of earlier painting, which is fascinating. as well as the photography.
David, I mean, could you just say something maybe about kind of Klein's legacy? I mean, we could be spending another hour talking about that, but just in general, in terms of how we might kind of view him, the perspective today.
Well, I think for me, I mean, he's very important in street photography. Any history of street photography is going to have a whole chapter really on William Klein. That's the case with the classic one by Joel Mayer, what's his name? I forgot his name. Mayer. It doesn't matter.
Joel Meyerowitz.
Yeah, Meyerowitz, that's right. His book on street photography has a whole chapter on William Klein. He sees him as that important. But I think Klein also had a great influence on subsequent photographers, and probably mainly I would pick out Gary Winogrand, a really important 1960s American photographer who has a very, very similar kind of offbeat kind of attitude, kind of shooting off rolls and rolls and rolls of film, kind of just pointing it at people almost randomly in the streets. That kind of attitude is sort of expanded really in Gary Winogrand's work. So he's the main figure for me anyway, who continues the legacy. But one final thing I would say is that what's very interesting today is to see how, it would be rather narrow possibly just to think of him in terms of the history of photography. And that, it'd be very interesting to see how the show in New York, which is on currently, I believe, whether it contributes to a reassessment of Klein, which is not just confined, in fact, to photographic history, but has a slightly broader kind of base.
And Marcus, you had an interaction even at Masterpiece, didn't you, with someone?
Well, I mean, a lot of people know William for different sections of his work. So I had someone talking to me about they picked up a postcard on the stand and it was a fashion image, and they said, "Is this William Klein?" Because I lecture on William on film, and I use a film shot in Africa of the ANC convention. And did he really do fashion? And it's like, people know William Klein for lots of different things. And so, you can know William Klein for his films with the 1968 student uprising in Paris. There's so many things that you can know William for. Also for being quite a character as well.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite repeatable anecdote?
Yes. Well, there's when we were getting together for the Tate Modern exhibition, William was invited to London to look at the rooms in Tate Modern, which were going to be used for his exhibition. And I was with William, and we were going through the rooms and with all the curators, and it was a group of about 8 of us that were going through. And there was an exhibition by Gabriel Orozco on at the time, and William just didn't like Orozco's work. And we went through this room, and there was a shoebox, empty shoebox on the floor, and they had the duty manager with a young student, and the duty manager was telling the student off for moving the shoebox with his foot. And he moved it a centimeter or so, and the duty manager was saying, "This cost $68,000. It's property of the Met in New York and MoMA in New York." And it's, and we heard this from a way away. And William, you could see, he walked, I was walking with him, and he walked up to sort of confront the duty manager. And then you could see William's thought process change, right? When he was going to confront the duty manager, and he lifted his foot back slowly. And he kicked the shoebox right across the room. And the duty manager couldn't breathe because he'd been telling this kid off for moving it a centimeter with his foot. Yeah. And there the shoebox had been right across the gallery, hit the wall sort of thing. And I was like, I need to have that on film. And I also want to have the report on the situation, because it's a really kind of interventionist thing. And the next day I got a call from the Tate Modern to say not to worry, they'd hashed the whole thing up.
Well, it's out now,
Yeah.
being live cast as we speak.
So William was protecting the kid. He protects the underdog.
Yeah.
You know, William also, when we were in Paris once, and William was we were doing a book signing, and William was signing a whole lot of books, and some guy brought along a whole lot of records, right, with images of William's on the covers of the albums, and I was like horrified. I was like, William, you can't sign these. You know, there's just a pile of them. And he said, look, this is all he's got. You know, this guy doesn't have much. And so William signed away, you know, and the guy who owned the albums was kind of looking away. It took 5 minutes or so, you know, and signing away each one. And then up came an image from Avdon. Yeah. And without looking up or anything, William just signed Richard Avdon across and you know, it was like back in the pile. And he's very sharp, you know, and he can be a very kind person, but he can also be really in your face. So if you aren't on the ball, or he feels like he's got a game to play with you, he'll either insult you to see if you can come back with something. And, you know, a lot of times people are kind of floored by it, but he's looking for a rise, you know.
Does anyone in the audience have experience of William Klein directly? I mean, has anyone got any anecdotes that you'd be able to share? Or indeed, if no anecdotes, and any questions? Still got a few minutes, I think, for any questions. Thank you.
So the Met Museum has stopped identifying artists by nationality. Does Mr. Klein identify as French, as both?
He travels on an American passport, but he really likes, he's very famous in France, and he loves it, because you take him anywhere out on the street and people come up and push a camera in his face and photograph him. I'm always like, not so close, but William, you know, he likes it, you know, he likes the attention. So he has strong roots to the United States. He reads the New Yorker magazine cover to cover. He's really well informed. He won't go back to the States. He's not going to, you know, Paris is home. But in Paris, he's known as an American photographer, you know, an American artist. But in the States, he's most probably known as being assimilated French.
Anyone else with a question? Gentleman at the back there. I think it'd be just as well to get it on the microphone. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know that about the Met. It showed a lovely photograph of the number 19 bus. Could you tell us about when that occasion that he came to Britain to take that photograph? Yeah, it's going to Islington, by the way.
Yeah.
I was a bit shocked.
That was, William came to London, I think it was with Vogue, and he had a great time in London. He stayed at I think it was, he stayed in London for about a month, and he really enjoyed afternoon teas. And so William, to this day, is, you know, when you visit him in the afternoon, has a massive pot of tea, and, you know, tea and cakes is his favorite thing.
Thanks. And just interesting, because he described the photograph you showed of the 4 people in New York from the New York magazine. He describes a Yiddish mama, but no one would ever use that expression anymore. Probably know what it meant. That's really interesting that you said that at the time. Thank you.
So the graphics in this, William did a film where he put posters around Paris, and it was just garbled letters, and that it was also like filmed on a bus going through Paris. You kind of see the posters you can't understand, and it's also the whole theme of the film is not really understanding. And so letters, William likes letters, and he likes mucking them around. So this brings together the graphics and his love of letters.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Can you say something more about his firing? Did Diana Vreeland fire him?
Yes, I mean the film was. He really set up he really did a spoof on her in the film, and William was very upset about being fired. He just didn't realize how much he had upset the whole fashion industry, because he'd taken the mickey. In the film, he was taking fashion to extreme, he felt. So he got sheets of metal and cut them out, right? And made them, and then bent them round, and those were the dresses. The metal cut into the actresses, and in the film they're bleeding. It's real blood, And there was William saying, and then they go onto the catwalk, and it's these women in these sheets of metal, and Diane Friedlander is saying, "Oh, it's magnifique," and the next season they were using metal dresses, in circles. As if William was thinking they'll never use metal, and then the next
Rabanne comes along.
Paco Rabanne, they took the, so William had a whole love-hate relationship with fashion. His wife, Jeannie, was incredibly good looking. She was used as a model. She didn't like modeling, but she modeled when they didn't have much cash. And so she paid, when they were newlywed, they didn't have much money. She did modeling assignments to bring in cash. And so there was a love-hate relationship with fashion.
So we are up to time. If there are any final questions, we could take one more, but otherwise it just remains for me to say thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Marcus. Thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. And